to another video. The 10th of December came and brought sim racers across the world an early Christmas present. LMGT3's for Le Mans Ultimate. In this video, I'm going to go through my initial impressions after spending 3 to 4 hours pounding out the laps. I'm going to let you know which of the 4 cars that came I consider to be my favorite at this point, and what you can expect from them if you haven't yet taken them to the track. And of course, I'm going to answer the obvious question of how good are they? How well have Studio 397 done? Are these now the best GT3 cars, even though they're LMGT3's, you can race online in 2024? So, spoiler alert, I'm going to jump straight into it. Put your fingers in your ears, close your eyes if you don't want to know. I'll leave a timestamp of where you should skip ahead to, where I'll go through my findings and experiences and description of what you can expect. But what cars are we talking about first? It's the BMW M4 LMGT3, the Chevrolet Corvette Z06 LMGT3R. We also have the Ferrari 296 GT3. Last but least, the free DLC that we got in the Pack 3 update, the McLaren Z20S LMGT3 Evo. Okay, so first spoiler, which of the 4 cars is currently my favorite to drive? It's the McLaren Z20S LMGT3 Evo. I'll explain why later. Next question, how good are they? They are amazing. Undoubtedly, they are now my favorite GT3 cars out of any of the titles I've driven in the last 2 years. Yes, that means I prefer them to the GT3 cars in Assetto Corsa Competizione. I prefer them to the GT3 cars in Assetto Corsa. I prefer them to the GT3 cars in Automobilista 2. And going back some, I prefer them to all of my experiences of the GT3s in iRacing, which goes back 4 or 5 years, where I'm very sorry to everyone that loves iRacing. I'm not hating on iRacing, but I hated driving the GT3s in iRacing 4 or 5 years ago. So much so that I would only drive the Lamborghini. I did actually start to enjoy the Porsche 911 GT3 when it came out, but other than those two, I really despised driving the GT3s. I was spoilt by the GTEs. Okay, so enough of the spoilers. What else did we get with this update? Well, for us VR racers, we got some proper VR support. We can now map buttons to recenter the headset position. We can increase and decrease the IPD. We now have a proper in-game HUD in VR, which we can adjust the scale on. We also now can adjust the scale of the menu in VR as well, which to a non-VR racer might not sound like a lot. But to those of us that spend all of our time racing in VR, that quality of life improvement is amazing. Those who are getting tired of doing just the daily, weekly and the odd special event, we also now have the opportunity of racing online championships and dedicated servers for hosting. I've already seen in the Le Mans Ultimate Discord channel multiple leagues that have sprung up overnight because now the league admin can host their own events and start planning out a schedule. I'm not going to dig into all of the details of the update. We've got, as I said, those improvements to the VR quality of life, there are improvements to AI, and there are improvements to large-scale memory usage optimization, which hopefully will result in higher FPS, which again for us VR racers is essential. Studio 397 state that they've improved texture loading performance as well, and we should see around a 30% improvement, and they've added an HTML broadcast overlay system with WEX styling, so you don't need to go out and get a third-party option. And as I expected on Monday when I did my Farewell to GTE broadcast, if you go into Le Mans Ultimate today, as of yesterday, you'll see that all of the daily races, weekly races and special events are all hypercars, LMP2s, which have made a resurgence. The community asks them to be included in some of the events, and of course the LMGT3's, but you won't see any official races that have any of the GTE cars in, because of course they no longer racing WEC. They're from 2023 and this is the 2024 season of WEC. So enough talking about the events we can do and the other functionality that's come and the other options to race. Let's talk about the cars. So the first car that I tried out was the Ferrari 296 LMGT3. The reason I went with the Ferrari was because I put out a poll at the beginning of the week to see which of the 4 cars we were getting, the free DLC McLaren 720S, or the Corvette Z06, or the Ferrari 296, or the BMW M4, which one I should A, practice in first, potentially race exclusively for the first few weeks, and also what the community thought of the 4 cars, which was their favourite. And the Ferrari took an immediate lead. As of now, 73 votes are in, and 38% of you said it had to be the Ferrari. So the Ferrari it was. I selected the car, selected the session, jumped into the car, and then thought, actually, let's have a look at the default balance setup for the fixed series, just to get an understanding of mechanically and aerodynamically how has the car been set up, so that I could gauge my impressions of how the car drove and how it differed to the GTEs that I've been racing exclusively for the past couple of months, so that my impressions weren't biased or influenced, I should say, by the setup, rather by the intrinsic nature of the car. Up until now, I've been exclusively racing GT3s in Assetto Corsa Competizione, so I also wanted to remind myself what the difference was between a GT3 and an LMGT3. So the global series, the GT World Challenge that's in Assetto Corsa Competizione, that's the event held across obviously various countries with manufacturer diversity. They feature a wide range of GT3 cars from Audi, BMW, Ferrari, Lamborghini, and the various others that we know. Ford came most recently to ACC just a few months ago. Technical regulations of GT World Challenge adhere to FIA GT3 technical regulations, and they include performance balancing to ensure competitive racing. The driver lineups, they typically include professional drivers as well as quote-unquote gentleman drivers, and the tyres use a variety of tyre brands including Pirelli and Hankook. Whereas the World Endurance Championship LMGT3's that are emulated in Le Mans Ultimate focus on endurance racing. So the WEC LMGT3 class is part of the World Endurance Championship, focusing on those longer endurance races. So they have special adaptations that include WEC specific adaptations such as luminescent number panels and leader lights. The manufacturer participation features entries from Aston Martin, BMW, Corvette, Ferrari, Ford, Lexus, Lamborghini, McLaren and Porsche, which I confess now is the mark I am most looking forward to having available in Le Mans Ultimate whenever it gets released. So the technical platform in WEC is based again on the FIA GT3 technical platform, but as I said, with those additional WEC specific regulations. When it comes to tyres, all marques use the same Goodyear tyres, and it's a Goodyear tyre manufacturer deal that is exclusive for the LMGT3 class, so no variants. Both classes use GT3 cars then, so GT World Challenge and WEC LMGT3's, but the WEC LMGT3 class has those additional regulations and adaptations to fit endurance racing. I ran through that because I had to remind myself when getting into the car that this shouldn't feel exactly the same as a GT World Challenge GT3, that I can't do a direct comparison between whether it is iRacing and the experience there, or AMS2 or ACC. So it's more about how do they drive, and they drive amazingly. So as soon as I got into the Ferrari 296, it reminded me straight away of when I first jumped into the Ferrari 488 GT3 in iRacing 5-6 years ago, whenever they came out, after exclusively spending time in the 488 GTE. And the GTE cars, just like in Le Mans Ultimate, had a softer ride. That's how I'll describe it. Because of the additional downforce that they had, they felt more connected on the track. They felt more hooked up, especially through the medium to high speed corners. I mean, you've seen those huge diffusers that those cars have, but also the suspension geometry, and I am not a mechanical engineer, but the geometry felt softer. So as soon as I got into that 488 GTE, the front axle felt stiffer, and that is exactly what I felt jumping into the 296 LMGT3 in Le Mans Ultimate. I could feel the lack of downforce compared to the GTE, but I could also feel the inherent lack of grip. You couldn't take as much speed through the medium and high speed turns, but the comparison to the iRacing GT3 ended there. As I said earlier in the video, unfortunately I just did not enjoy the GT3s in iRacing 4, 5, 6 years ago. They may well be hugely different today, so I apologize if my experience is outdated, but I truly did not enjoy them. I did not like it at all. The cars felt like they skated across the track. They felt too stiff, too inflexible. I was amazed that people could pedal them around the track at any particular rate of speed, let alone the lap times that the aliens were getting out of them. In Le Mans Ultimate, I jumped into the 296, left the pit lane, and lapped for about 15 minutes with a smile on my face. The car was controllable at all times, even when the slip angle meant that I would start to oversteer and potentially start to lose the back of the car. There were a few offs, but that was because I was being exuberant. But I was able to just lap and lap and lap. Yes, the front axle felt a bit stiffer. Yes, it had less downforce, but it was such an enjoyable experience. And again, I will put that down to the fact that in Le Mans Ultimate, driving is intuitive. I don't care whether it's the most realistic or not. Obviously I do, I'm biased. But what I mean is whether empirically it is the most realistic physics is irrelevant. From a driving experience, what it gives me, and for those who also feel that the Le Mans Ultimate experience is what suits their driving style, to go from the GTEs and jump into the GT3s and still enjoy it, that was a huge win, a big tick. When I jumped into the BMW M4, it again reminded me of the BMW M4 in Assetto Corsa Competizione. So the steering lock, the steering ratio that you put in, the distance that you seem to sit away from the dash, it still feels like you're sitting in an M8. But also some of its driving characteristics were similar. For me, driving the various marques in Assetto Corsa Competizione were, let's just say, challenging. When driving them on the aggressive setups or on the basic setups, it was just always a painful experience for me. It wasn't until I came across the increase your caster to maximum hack to get control over the front of the car that they became drivable for me. But of all of the cars, it was the BMW M4 and the McLaren 720S that I found the most enjoyable when racing. I always wanted to drive the Lamborghini, but the Lamborghini, again, until I put that huge front caster on, was always a beast to drive. In Le Mans Ultimate, for me, the M4 is the easiest of the 4 cars we just got to drive. It drives like it's not only on rails, it drives like it has too much downforce. I found that instead of having moments in the Ferrari that were exuberant with oversteer, so for instance, if I was to try and be completely and utterly like thunderfoot and put my foot down in first gear, especially out of the hairpin, in the Ferrari, I'm turning around, I'm doing a 360. In the BMW, it was like, yeah, we got traction for days. Now again, I don't know if that was because of the difference in the setup between the BMW and the Ferrari, or if it's intrinsically its mechanical grip, but the BMW felt on rails. Across the front axle, it felt softer than the Ferrari, so straight away that was another tick. The 2 cars felt different. They had different behaviors, different characteristics. They had a different persona, and they were probably enjoyable in their own way. But I don't know how to say this. I kind of felt like I was cheating. The BMW just made it too easy. Obviously I wasn't fast, so obviously I would need to go and tweak the setup in the intermediate sessions so that you've got the open setups, and see if I can elicit some more speed out of it. But I was in danger of just understeering everywhere rather than ever losing the back in an oversteer moment. Whereas the Corvette kind of like did the Goldilocks thing and sat in between the two. So it had a much more nimble, much more dynamic driving experience than the BMW. It didn't feel like it was just over tired with lots of grip and perhaps less power than the tires could allow for torque, so that you were always in control of the car. The Corvette came with a softer ride on the front axle than the Ferrari, but with that same behavior characteristic of, if whether it was first gear or second gear, if I put my foot down out of a hairpin, the back would come around. So it was, again, it was 3 different cars, 3 different behavioral traits. You also, across the 3 of them, had 3 completely different power profiles, torque profiles. You had the high revving Ferrari, which I love. I always prefer to drive a car, usually the European marques, where they rev up to like 6, 7, 8,000 RPM, rather than something that's perhaps a more, I don't know, it's like those big muscle car, big block engines that you'd expect from a Mustang or a Corvette, where all of their power, all of their torque is in the lower power band. So you don't rev them out at 7, 8,000, you have to shift earlier. So it was interesting seeing that, again, to adapt jumping from one car to the other. As I don't usually like to look at the LEDs for RPM, I do to try and pay attention, but I usually go beyond the red line if I stare at them for too long. I usually do it by ear, and I'd find going from the Ferrari jumping to the BMW, I was like, I've got to shift so much earlier in the BMW. It's a completely different power profile. And then similarly, jumping into the Corvette, again, shift at a completely different rev point. And it took a while to get my ear used to the fact that these 3 cars, 3 different engines, you have to drive them completely differently. And I really loved that. I really loved the fact that you didn't just have a vanilla cookie cutter profile where, and again, I'm not critiquing, I completely understand why, but where if I thought back to iRacing when we got the V8 supercars in and we went from having the Ford to getting the Holden, it was just a cosmetic thing. Both cars had the same mechanical makeup under the skin, yeah? The only thing that was different between the 2 cars was the shell. Whereas, roll forward and in Le Mans Ultimate, you could close your eyes, you could do a blind lap, and you would know, if you could stay on the track that is, what was coming back to you through the steering wheel, the force feedback, what was coming back to you through your headphones would be 3 completely different cars that require 3 completely different approaches to driving them. Tick, tick, tick. But then I jumped into the McLaren 720S and it was perfection. It had everything the former 3 cars had. So it was more nimble than the BMW for me. It had a nice soft front end like the BMW, in between the BMW and the Corvette. And it had that you can just put your foot down in first gear out of every turn, no matter how tight the apex is, traction and torque that you got from the BMW. And I was questioning, what approach are Studio 397 going to take? Are they going to take the approach of, we will make the free DLC, the OP car that gets released in the DLC, to encourage people to buy the game because they'll hear good things about the free DLC, or to take the approach of iRacing and make the newly released paid for DLC, the OP car, to get those who already own the game to go and splash the cash on the new content. And right now, I don't know if any of the cars have a performance advantage. However, the McLaren most definitely has the easiest path of entry into getting into a higher performing lap time for anyone new to the game. In my opinion, it is just easy to jump into it and jump in and be fast, drive it quickly. The BMW is easy to jump into and be safe, to pretty much never feel that the car is going to be out of control. The Corvette is for perhaps those who want a little bit more excitement and a little bit more adept at being in control of a car that has oversteer as an intrinsic trait, and where you have to be careful putting the power down, and you don't want to just be one of 50 billion Ferraris on track. It's a little bit more challenging. Whereas the Ferrari, the 296, is possibly, in my opinion, the most nimble. It's probably the one that will require the most adept throttle management, but it's not scarily ridiculously difficult to keep on the track. So if you prefer Ferrari and you enjoy Ferrari, you can still jump into it and just lap. And I put that down, in my opinion, again, to the Le Mans Ultimate physics, because you don't have to consciously think about, how do I have to drive this car to be in control of it? How do I have to drive this car to maintain its grip through low speed, medium speed, high speed? How do I have to, you get what I mean? Because however they've done it, Le Mans Ultimate through Studio 397 have, for me, a physics engine that is just intuitive. What you feel through your force feedback, what you see through your eyes, what you get through your pedals if you have any haptic response, just makes sense to your brain. So when you're driving the car and you start to feel, however you feel it, whichever your senses transmits it to you, that you're understeering, or that you're oversteering, that you're perhaps bogging down in too high a gear, whatever it is, you just instinctively react to it, which just frees up so much more mental bandwidth to driving the lap. And I think it's in that, because the base platform, the fundamentals of the game are such a joy to drive, Studio 397 have just absolutely nailed it. I don't mean to be hyperbolic, but they truly have, in my opinion, nailed it. Considering I spent hours upon hours on Low Fuel Motorsports in Assetto Corsa Competizione over the summer, just doing lap after lap after lap, and I was loving it. I was absolutely loving it in the GT3's. But there's a particular way you have to drive the cars in Assetto Corsa Competizione. There's a particular way you have to drive them in Automobilista 2. There's a particular way you have to drive them in iRacing, right? But for me, I like the way you drive them in Le Mans Ultimate. For me, it just feels natural. It feels intuitive. And Studio 397 have released 4 cars with 4 different characteristics, 4 different behavior profiles, 4 different personalities, that whichever marque you prefer, you can jump into and just have fun. I'm quite sure that we will find out in the first 2 weeks, which is the OP car, right? Which is the one that's meta, which is the one that people say you need to be in this if you're at Le Mans, you need to be in that if you're at, I don't know, Imola. However, if you just want to enjoy it and you want to stick to the car you like and build proficiency in it, I don't think you can go wrong with any of the 4. I prefer the McLaren because right now, for me, it gives me the best of all worlds and will allow me to go and search for performance. If it wasn't the McLaren, I would 100% be happy to do it in the Ferrari. I'd be less inclined to do it in the Corvette just because it doesn't sing to me like the McLaren or the Ferrari do. And strangely, whereas the BMW is my go-to in Assetto Corsa Competizione, it's the last car I would drive in Le Mans Ultimate, but not for the reasons you'd expect. As I said, it's because it doesn't challenge me. Now that might just be that that's this week's baseline setup. It might change after the next hot fix, and it might be that once you get into the realms of tweaking your own setup in the open setups, that the BMW becomes uber challenging. It could also be, and let's admit it, it's much likely that this is, it's much more likely that this is the reason. I probably was just underdriving it and just wasn't extracting any of it. I probably was just like, I don't know, 5-6 seconds off the pace, who knows. But that's the only reason, not because it's a bad car, not because it feels bad, not because it doesn't make sense, just because I didn't find it as challenging. How great is that? How do you feel about them? Have you driven them? If so, which one has grabbed your heart, puts a smile on your face? Do you agree with my observations, or am I on cloud cuckoo land? What do you think? And if so, why? I'd really like to hear it. Add it into the comments. Let's get involved in this conversation. And again, I don't want to hate on any other sim, but if you've been driving any of the others recently, how do the LMGT3's compare in your opinion? And does this video make you think I was holding out, I wasn't going to buy it, but now I might do it? If so, A like would be appreciated, share would be even more appreciated, a subscription is always good for the soul, but most importantly, comment. I'll see you in the next video.